I'm going to read from the Gospel of St. Mark, the 2nd chapter, but I want to sort of set the stage with you this morning. And I think you turn to your pew Bibles or your Bibles that you brought. It's going to be on the screen. But let me tell you what happens just a few verses, just a few moments before we hear this passage. Jesus has already begun his ministry. And one of the things he does is he calls Levi, who is a tax collector. I want to remind you, because we know this, but to remind us that tax collectors in that part of the world, in Palestine, were actually Jewish. And the Roman government had invited them or encouraged them, or they had applied to be tax collectors, which meant that the way they made their money was to get the taxes that were due Rome and then add on something for themselves. And that is where the rub came in. Is that the rub came in when they added more on for themselves than they really should have. And so they were considered traitors. And so if you think of people who are very devoted to the religion, and what we should say, the religious authorities, if you think about how devoted they are to that, and then to realize that Jesus, whom some are beginning to sort of sense there's something special about him, goes and tells a tax collector, "Come, follow me." And then do you know what Jesus does? Is he eats in the home of Levi. And already then, people are beginning to discover something about Jesus. And that is that he does not conform to the way in which people practice religion. And there's already this conversation then, because John fasts, and so do his disciples. But the disciples of Jesus do not fast, and this is where this begins. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to Jesus, "Why do John's disciples fast and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests cannot fast while the bridegroom is with them, can they? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak. Otherwise, the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and so are the skins. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Will you pray with me? Oh Lord, in the silence of this moment, prepare our hearts and minds to hear your word for us this day. Work your will in our lives. Amen. So when I was a young boy and in elementary school, we all wore jeans. Nobody wore khakis. We wore jeans. And we couldn't wear shorts. It was the day in which there were dress codes, and there was no air conditioning in school. Now, I also walked about 5 miles every morning in the snow to school as well, but everything I told you besides that is really true and factual. So what happened was, in the days when it was not fashionable, the knees on our jeans would begin to wear faster than any other place. And so what our mothers did is they would take patches, and some of you then are sort of shaking your head, take patches and patch the knees. Now it's become very fashionable not to patch the knees, and in fact, the worse they look, the more expensive they become, which means I should have saved all of those hundreds of pairs of jeans I had growing up, because I could now retire probably. But nevertheless, what she would do is she'd place a patch on the knees, as well as everybody else. Now I really have difficulty sitting still, and what I do when I'm in a meeting, and I think this annoys people, but people don't tell me that I annoy them anymore when I'm around. I need to tell you, it's one of the privileges of being a bishop. Nobody ever says, "Oh, that's annoying me." Now, when I had a church staff for 15 years, there was some of those people, and they would say, "That is annoying me." Nobody tells me anything like that anymore. And so what I would do is, I would doodle, but when I was a young boy, what I'd do is I'd begin to pick at the knee patch. You know how that is? And it was so easy because the new patch would not go on the old jeans all that well. And so much of the time, the reason we have difficulty in terms of understanding the gospel is we keep trying to do the presentation of the new wine, the gospel, and we want it to look like it did 50 years ago. Now, if you and I begin to think, for example, about how the Christian witness has morphed over the last 2,000 years, it is really astounding, isn't it? The printing press changed everything. The digital culture is changing everything. And what I've learned is that anything we get familiar with or that just feels very good to us, we consider to be the real thing, which means it's the real gospel. They begin to confuse practices with the message. But what I've learned is that in my life and ministry is that the gospel can be presented in a number of ways, and it can still be fresh. It can still be fresh. And that's what I know about the good news, is that this new wine is permanently new, because it's about the transformation of a human being and a human life and a community. But what we need to do is to begin to realize is that we get stuck. We get stuck in terms of the way in which we talk about the gospel or thinking about how we live out the gospel or our expectations of each other or even what we really expect God to do. And Jesus was one of the ultimate persons who began to challenge the culture in which he lived. He challenged the culture because he began to challenge the religious leaders that you're more worried about fasting, you're more worried about the way in which you present the idea, the religious idea that the Jewish people had of God. And what you've done is you've actually corrupted that which has been very good. You understand? So one of the things we've got to do is we've got to realize is that we live in a very different world today than we did even 30 years ago. The communities in which we live are very diverse. The ways in which people learn are very diverse. The ways in which people live into a relationship with our Jesus the Christ are very different. And the truth be told is we live in a culture now, and instead of thinking, oh, we got to get everybody, we heard this week at clergy retreat, instead of getting everybody to have a Christian worldview, what we need to do, I believe, is this. Because the reason why the Christian witness has difficulty in our culture is because we're trying to get everybody to have our worldview. What we need to do is we need to see the world as God does. We need to begin to see people through the eyes of our God and see them as God does. Rather than get people to conform to a worldview, because God didn't talk anything. Jesus didn't talk anything about a worldview. He talked about a relationship with God. So one of the things I've been doing is I've traveled across the North Texas Conference. I began in June at annual conference, is began to talk about the culture. And I don't want to talk about the culture necessarily in the community, but the culture that the people in the North Texas Conference, the people called Methodists in the North Texas Conference, the kind of culture we need to adapt or to adopt in order to reach persons with this good news, this new wine. And the culture is simple. And while I'm not going to flesh it out for you about how to do it, but there are three pieces of that culture that I know are very significant. And I knew them before I even came to Dallas. And I knew them as a pastor of a church for 15 years. And actually, it's by pastoring that church and the experiences that I had in my work with the Board of Ordained Ministry in the Central Texas Conference throughout my ministry that has convinced me that this is important to spread good news. I talk about it like this, and people hear it a lot, and everybody in my previous congregation could say it with me. That really what we're called to do is tell the story of Jesus so that his story can become another story. We're to tell and live the story of Jesus so that his story can become another story. And so the culture has three legs. The first is that we have to develop a culture of invitation. Now, it doesn't take long when you get into one of the Gospels, early on in the Gospels, and in Mark, since there's no birth story other just one line, in the Gospels, that you realize that what Jesus is doing is he's calling people to be his followers. He invites them. And look how he does it. He says, "Follow me." In another account, one of the earliest disciples tells his brother, "Come and see." And so I like to talk about it this way, is that one of the things we do is we talk about come and see what God is doing. And God is doing magnificent things through your church and through the other 300 plus churches in the North Texas Conference. And so what is it that you can say to someone about God? God is doing wonderful things that can transform your life. Come and see. Now, I promise you this to be true, that more than half of the people who live within a driving distance of this church do not have a faith home. Now, everybody self-identifies themselves as having a church or a community of faith. But throughout my ministry, I have more people who've identified themselves as Methodists. And then I ask the question, so tell me what church you go to. And they go, well, and so there are a lot of people who identify themselves as Methodists who don't go anywhere. Now, this is the good thing. Now, there's a good piece about this. There are actually more people who self-identify themselves as Baptists and don't go anywhere than there are Methodists. And that's just because there are more of them. And I don't say that in any way except to say, I'm talking about a vital relationship. And I learned this as the pastor. So when I was at First United Methodist Church of Hurst, and in our fast-growing years, I mean, just every Monday evening, I had 4 or 5 sheets of first-time guests to call. It was great. And then the suburb begins to change significantly. And not everybody around us looks like us. And people move farther and farther out. And we began to talk about how is it that Methodists can begin to adopt a culture of invitation with people they know about come and see what God is doing. So not to detail everything we went through, and one of the things we did turned out to be somewhat of a failure, except I had a unique experience. We began to, 2 or 3 times a year at significant times of the year, we would go hang door hangers on people's doors. I don't recommend this. The rate of return is not good. Except that one December morning, 2 or 3 weeks before our congregation was going to have a large Christmas musical presentation, which it did every year, 3 different presentations, 1,200 people at each one. We'd see somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 people in a weekend. I began to walk a neighborhood. It was colder than today, but it was raining. And there was a young man with a young girl in his yard. She was riding her bike in the driveway, and he was putting up Christmas decorations. And he was friendly, and I introduced myself and began to visit. And he said, "You're the minister at the Methodist Church in Hurst?" And I said, "Yes." And I want to tell you, we're walking in Hurst. We're actually in the city of Hurst when I'm having this conversation. We're in North Hurst, but I said, yes. He said, "I didn't know there was a Methodist church in Hurst." Now, there are 4,000 members of that church. And he didn't know there was a Methodist church in Hurst, which was sort of an indictment of several thousand members, I want to say. And I said, "Oh, well, let me tell you where it is." And he said, "I'm coming tomorrow morning." He said he had told me he was a Methodist, but he didn't go anywhere. And so he came the next morning. I saw him walk down through the narthex on the way to Sunday school to take his daughter, whom I'd met the previous day, and a woman who was with him. And I knew he was divorced and a single parent, sole custody of his child. And so then later he introduces me to her, and it's his fiance. And that was the first Sunday they were there, and they were there every Sunday after that, except when they were on vacation for the next 2 years while I was the pastor there. Now, the thing that happened is then they began to invite people to come with them. They were family, but they still began to invite people and other people. So his parents came. And then her parents came. And then because he trusted me enough, he came to my office one day along with his fiance to talk about something that was deeply troubling to him and to her. He was the guardian of his adult sister. And her life was a mess. And it's unimportant for you to know why or any of those things, but let me tell you, it would be taxing for anyone to be the adult guardian of somebody who had been that irresponsible. And he chose to be the guardian so that his parents didn't have to do that anymore. And he was clear about how he dealt with it, and he did it very well. But he simply wanted some affirmation and confirmation. And so we talked about it. We spent an hour and a half. And about once a week he'd check in with me and tell me the latest piece and what he had done. And that, I need to tell you, I think, was one of the most significant pastoral experiences I've had in the last 2 or 3 years. So fast forward, I'm elected a bishop. It's my last Sunday at Hearst. I'm no longer the pastor of that church. I feel like a guest in the own place in which I'd been for 15 years. It was the weirdest experience of my life. 6 weeks earlier, I'd been the pastor. Now I'm nobody with nothing. I mean, I had 6 weeks I didn't have a job. I mean, I began to have a heart for people. I mean, I got paid, though, but I had 6 weeks, and I didn't have anything to do. And I go back to the church my last Sunday, and they come through the line, and they say, "We're going to be okay. Do not worry about us." And then he goes to the person who's the senior associate there, who is now the senior pastor of that church, and said, "Hey, you're the man now." And I realized what had happened is that this one of the reasons why I was excited about the pastoral work I'd done is he wasn't tied to me. He was tied to that community faith and his relationship with God. So last May, I received an email from his father. Dear Mike, a couple of years ago, you introduced our son and his fiancée to your church. And they introduced First Hearst to us. And they introduced First Hearst to... And he said, what I want you to know is this Saturday, they will be married in the sanctuary of First Hearst. And Pastor Phil, who's my successor, will do the wedding. And then this is the line that every time I say it, I realize why we do what we do. I want to thank you for the love of Jesus in our lives. And the reason I say that is because no one just walks in a place anymore. Someone at a PTA meeting or on the soccer field or next door or at work who begin to have some difficulty in their life. And I want to encourage you to develop a culture of invitation, and you can say to them, come and see what God is doing. Because I believe that each person here can introduce another person to our God. And that person will be deeply grateful for you, for the love of Jesus in their lives. So part of the culture about what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus is what is a culture of invitation like. Secondly, it's a culture of call. Now, I can talk about culture of call in terms of culture, what it means to follow Jesus for laypersons, for clergy, and for future clergy. But I want to speak specifically about clergy for a moment with you, because this is a critical piece in terms of what it means in the North Texas Conference. While I am the bishop until September 1, 2020, which is the day I have to retire, over half of the clergy in the North Texas Conference will either retire or be eligible for retirement. So my successor and I have a daunting task about how do we then find persons for ministry. Couple that with the fact that the Dallas-Fort Worth area is growing more rapidly than any other place. And, Dallas, the Dallas Metroplex is actually moving north to Oklahoma, to the Oklahoma border. Did you know that? I mean, you're out here far enough, you should. And the trouble is the finding clergy who are going to do that. Now, I can remember about my own call to ordained ministry, and it has several pieces along the way that are important. But this is the one I want to share with you this morning, and that is when I was in the 6th grade, my parents were divorced. And prior to the divorce of my parents, or the separation and then their subsequent divorce, my father sat with my younger brother Pat and me on the back row of the sanctuary. And my mother sang in the choir. And when they were separated, then my mother moved us off of the back pew. I mean, you don't want to put an 11 and 9-year-old boy by themselves on a back pew. I mean, all kinds of things could happen, I want to tell you. And we were good kids, but she moved us close enough because she was over here in the choir, and so she moved us so she could see us about that way, about 6 pews back, and she could watch and see what happened. Except one of the great things is seated on that same pew was this couple, and we called him Colonel Green because he's retired from the Army, and he taught business and was the Dean of Men. It was in the day, the Dean of Men at Texas Wesleyan College, and he taught the largest adult Sunday school class at the church in which I grew up. He was a great guy. His wife was wonderful. Bill and Marge were wonderful people. And so he began to ask me, Mike, what'd you learn in Sunday school today? Nobody had asked me that before in my life. And we began to talk. And then after about a year, I realized, he's teaching class. I should ask him what he taught. So I said, Colonel, tell me what you taught today. Well, this went on for a couple of years. We had this great, great experience just on Sunday morning, before and after service, praying together, singing together. And I'll never forget, after the benediction one Sunday, he put his hand on my shoulder, big hand, little boy, Mike, has anyone or have you ever thought about becoming a preacher? That's what we talked about, a preacher. And what he didn't know is I had. But I didn't think I could do it. But somehow this man that I trusted and admired and respected began to, I think, be the very whisper of God's voice in my ear. So I want to tell you, is there's some student here, some young person, I'm specifically talking about young people, and it could be others, but frankly, they don't know what that means, and they just need somebody to affirm that in them. Have you ever thought about being a minister? Which today is a lot more broad of a conversation than it was when I was that age. Then it was just be a preacher. Now it's any form of ministry can pay. So what I'd encourage you to do is, I believe that someone, or more than one, is actually called to ordained ministry in the Creekwood Church. But what they're waiting for is someone to say something. And after the 8:30 service, a woman comes by me and said, I should have done this a couple of years ago. I believe my grandson ought to be a minister. I'm going to ask him that. Because he just recently graduated from college. He's in a job that she began to tell the story. And I want to tell you, nobody, hears audible voices anymore, I don't think. God uses your voice or your hand on someone's shoulder. So simply, in terms of leadership in the North Texas Conference, in terms of our clergy leadership, I would encourage you to look for those persons. Lastly, this. We need to develop a culture of servanthood. I believe that every baptized Christian is a minister. That's what it says in Discipline United Methodist Church. And I also believe that every baptized Christian then is a servant of Christ. Jesus uses some different words in the Gospel of John. It talks about being his friends. You're no longer my slave, you're my friend. But it's a whole issue of what it means to be a servant. What it means to be a servant. So what is your passion? What is it that you feel excited, and what brings you great joy in order of what it means to follow this Jesus? What does it mean for you to live and tell the story of Jesus? What brings you great passion? And I have several passions in terms of my own ministry that are very important to me. One is a whole ministry with the poor, which I don't understand a lot about, but which I've worked at for a number of years. And today, one of the things that I do for the United Methodist Church is I am the bishop who's responsible for convening that conversation about our ministry with the poor and developing best practices. So I have a passion about that. But there's servanthood going on in all of our churches, and I stay amazed by it. There's the one I learned about recently. So Joan and I go to Arkansas to visit some friends and to do something with them one day, and then we're driving back on Friday. And it's about dinner time, and I said, do you want to eat somewhere? Now, we like to eat in places we would not normally eat, which means when we go through a smaller town, we don't want to eat in a fast food restaurant. And so we had to stop at a place in Mount Vernon to get gas, and so I go in simply, hey, where's there a place to eat on Friday night? And the person began to tell me, well, there's a Sonic, and I'm going, this is not the right question to be asking this guy. I mean, he's sending me to the Sonic. There's nothing wrong with Sonic, but it's not exactly what Joan had in mind for my good health. And so we look around, and looking around Mount Vernon, we passed the Mount Vernon United Methodist Church, which is in our conference. I said, let's go. Looks like something's happening there. And so let's stop in, and it looks like they're getting ready for a fall bazaar festival or something the next day. I got the day wrong. I wasn't reading the sign. I didn't know. I'd forgotten the date, and I walked in on a wedding rehearsal. Now, the minister was up front of the sanctuary. He never saw me. Some people sort of saw me walk in, and I realized I'm in a wedding rehearsal. This is dangerous. And so I better get out of here because they're going to think I just am sort of some drifter coming across the highway looking for something. And I just happen to be the bishop of the North Texas Conference. They don't know who I am. And I'm just looking for a place to eat. Well, we go ahead and we go to Sulphur Springs. And on the way, Joan says, why don't you call Vic and Mary Brooke Cassad? Vic is the DS in Sulphur Springs. And they'll know a place to eat in Sulphur Springs. And turns out we have dinner with Vic that night. And I tell him in Mount Vernon, he said, do you know what happens in Mount Vernon? Well, no. Do you know what Mount Vernon's famous for? Does anybody in this room know? I see Cowboys jerseys and you don't know this? Don Meredith. Home of Don Meredith. Still the most fun quarterback ever in Cowboy history, I might add. Maybe not the most successful, but the most fun. And life's about having fun. So we stopped and we had dinner with Vic, and he said, let me tell you what happens in Mount Vernon Church. Every weekday during the summer. Now, I'm not talking about one day a week. Every weekday, Monday through Friday, they serve, listen to this, lunch to 150 children who are on free and reduced lunch at the school and otherwise would not be eating during the summer, during the week. They would skip a meal. I thought to myself, in Mount Vernon, somebody had a passion for kids who didn't have something. And someone decided to live out the story of Jesus, really. And I don't know what it is that God's calling you to do. But what I do know, until you find your passion about that own calling, about what it means to serve Him, you will never know the great joy. You will never know the great joy of what it means to be the fresh wineskin that Jesus wants to pour His new wine into. Will you pray with me? Holy God, for our time together, we give you thanks. For the love that you have for each one of us, we give you thanks. And oh God, as we heard earlier, we are prone to wander. But let us be reminded that you can take our hearts and seal them for your love eternally. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.